The shading environment was great, but let's add some particles to our level to really kick things up a bit. Now, there's a lot we can do with particles, but let's focus on one effect, a fire in a fireplace. So to create a particle effect in Stingray, it's actually quite simple, but I am being very specific on my directory structure. I've created a FX1 directory here at kind of a top level of my entire project, and you could really create this anywhere. It's more important that you actually use a specific directory than it is where it actually goes. So I'm going to go ahead and go into FX1, and as you can see in the scene here, I've already created a fire effect, and I'm going to show you exactly how to create that. Now, obviously I have it here, but I want you to pretend that this doesn't even exist, and I'm going to show you how to create this all from scratch. Now, before we jump in, there's a couple of background pieces of information you need to know. First thing is, if you've been working with particles in 3ds Max, you're probably used to something like this menu on the Super Spray. And there's a million parameters and a ton of menus. We don't have to deal with any of that in Stingray. In fact, if I go ahead and close all of these roll-ups, you can see that all of the particle systems are basically set up or segmented into these little different various types of topics. And that is actually quite similar to the way that Stingray works, the difference being you only need to call these in when you're ready to use them. The second piece of information you need to know is that we're going to be using what is called a sprite sheet. And this is a sprite sheet that I made for the fireplace. It consists of 25 different frames from a clip of video fire that I had. And there are lots of free software applications that you can get to make one of these things. The only thing that's really important to remember about the sprite sheet is the number of frames that you're going to include in the sprite sheet, because we need to know that information when we're creating the particle system in Stingray. So in this sprite sheet, I have 25 different frames in a single image. Okay, so now let's go ahead and start creating our particle system in Stingray. I'm going to move back a little bit so that I can get a little better bead on things. Okay, perfect. Now, remember, none of this exists. Let's create one from scratch. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is get our sprite sheet into Stingray so that we can apply it to the particle system that we're about to create. So I'm going to right-click in my asset browser here in the FX folder, and I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this sprite sheet. And there's our new folder. I'm going to go into that folder, and I'm going to import this asset. In miscellaneous chapter files, there's the sprite sheet texture. We'll go ahead and bring that in. So that was the sprite sheet texture. Let's go ahead and create the particle system. To create a particle system, all we have to do is right-click in the asset browser and choose Create, and then slide over to Particle Effect, and we need to give it a name. We'll call this one New Fire, and we'll say OK. Now, just like in 3ds Max, we have to get a lot of things set up properly before it starts to appear correctly in our scene. Over in our asset preview window, we can see that our particle system was really only just displaying one particle. So let's go ahead and set up some of the settings so that we can begin to see it. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the Explorer window, and we can see that our particle effects are here in our scene hierarchy. And if we click on the various particle effects, you can see that our menu changes. So whichever particle effect is selected over here is what is going to show over here. Now, remember all those rollouts in 3ds Max? Well, they kind of appear here in what we call a system hierarchy. So we have our particle effect, and here's our system. And if we open up the system, we can begin to see some of the things that may look similar to 3ds Max. If we right-click on the word system, there are all of the controls. And so when I was saying that we only needed to see them when we needed to see them, this is what I'm talking about. They are currently not applied to the system as it stands right now. We only need to add them when we want to take advantage of them. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our particle life set up, and I'm going to go to the top level of the system, and I'm going to say our particle life is going to be 1,000 by 1,000. And we really want a long particle life here so that it is always on screen for a very long time. And you can see there's our particle right there. It showed up in our asset preview. Since we're doing a billboard type of animation, we only really need one particle. So we'll go ahead and set that total number of particles to 1. Everything else we can leave the same. Now let's go ahead and make some changes to our system. By default, the system comes with a billboard visualizer, and we're going to want to use a different visualizer because we're using UV tile animation. So I'm going to select this billboard visualizer, and I'm going to remove this component. To add a new one, we're going to go to System, Deprecated, Billboard Material. This is where we're going to add our sprite sheet. So now I can go over to the sprite sheet folder, and I'm going to click and I'm going to drag this over to the diffuse map slot. It's important to remember the click and drag motion. If you click this first, it will change all of the settings that you see over here because it thinks you want to actually edit the image. Don't do that. Just click and drag. Okay, let's go back to our particle system over here, and let's add another system called UV Animation, and it's also located in the deprecated flyout, so we'll choose UV Animation. So this is why it was so important for me to understand how many frames are in that sprite sheet. I know that I have 25 images. So I'm going to set the max to 24 because the minimum number is 0, and 0 is actually a number. So that's total number value equals 25. We'll go ahead and set it to loop. And let's go ahead and double check our size now. Size can stay pretty small. I'm going to set this up to 0.5 and 0.5. And we can see in our preview window that we're starting to see the UV tile animation is beginning to appear, and we can see that that's starting to look a little bit like a fire. Back on UV animation, I want to slow things down a bit. I'm going to change the frame rate down to 10, and this will slow down the amount of change in our fire effect. Let's go ahead and save all of these changes. This is a really important thing to remember. You might have seen a little orange icon on the particle system, and that was indicating that I had changes that I had not yet saved. So you want to make sure that you hit the save button here so that you see any changes. Now I'm ready to drag it into the scene. I'll raise it up a little bit. Okay, now we're almost done. So let's go ahead and make a couple of other small tweaks. Down on our billboard material, I want to be sure to turn on additive blend, and this will just make it a little bit more pronounced within the scene. We don't have to change the color. Just double checking on the size. If we wanted to maybe increase it a little bit, we could. Make it a little bit larger, that's fine too. And then we're ready to place it in our scene. So all we would have to do is just position it in our fireplace. You can see I already have one here, and we'll focus in on that a little bit. So we can finish up with the particle system that we already had. Last little finishing touch that we're going to make is I've already created a light in the scene. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring in and place it in the fireplace and turn it on. We'll get a nice little fireplace glow coming from our particle effect. Let me go ahead and turn off the gizmos, and we can see the final result. So setting up particles is generally easy to do if you've had some experience doing it in 3ds Max. But with some practice, I'm sure you'll come up with some great effects.